While cooking one evening, you notice that you're missing one of the ingredients and have to decide whether to drive to the shops to try and get it. In making this decision, there are several risks that you might consider, like the risk that the shop is closed or doesn't have what you need. One thing that you probably wouldn't consider, though, is the risk that you'll have a fatal car accident on this short drive. It's not that this is impossible, it's just that the risk is so low, it's not worth factoring into the decision. Ignoring negligible risks is something that we do all the time. This is even an approach that's used in risk management, where these risks are called de minimis. The idea is that we set a de minimis threshold, say 1 in 10,000. Any risks that are below the threshold get ignored, so that we can focus attention on the more significant risks. Seems like a sensible policy, right? But there's a problem. Suppose several people have contracted a new infectious illness. If you walked into the quarantine facility without taking any precautions, there's a high risk you'd be infected. But what's the risk that you'd be infected in the first second after stepping through the door? Well, really low, maybe even de minimis. And what about the next second? Same thing. But if you ignore the possibility of getting infected in the first second, and you ignore the possibility of getting infected in the next second, and so on, then you have, in effect, ignored the possibility of getting infected at all. And that's definitely not something that you should ignore. It's almost like the de minimis threshold opens a loophole that would allow you to ignore anything that you didn't want to think about. So maybe we need to scrap the idea of a de minimis risk. When making a decision, maybe we need to consider every risk, no matter how slight. Some would definitely take that view, but I think the idea of a de minimis risk deserves a second look. Let's take a step back and ask ourselves, what is risk anyway? What does it mean to say that something is high or low risk? A lot of people assume that the risk of an event is measured by its probability. On this approach, risk is a bit like size. If something has a 1 in 10 chance, then it's a big risk. If it has a 1 in 10,000 chance, then it's a small risk. And a de minimis threshold is like a filter. Those risks that are small enough fall through the holes and get ignored, while the bigger risks are caught. But as the quarantine example shows, a big risk can be divided into a series of small risks. Anything can be forced through the filter. But maybe this isn't the only way to think about risk. In Shirley Jackson's chilling short story, The Lottery, we're told of a community that holds an annual lottery in which the winner is put to death. Now, the probability that you would be chosen in this lottery might be really low. After all, there may be many thousands of people in the community. Nevertheless, surely you would regard this as a very risky situation to be in. After all, someone is definitely going to be chosen. It could just as easily be you as anyone else. There'd be nothing abnormal about you being the person selected. These ideas lie behind something called normic risk, which, instead of focusing on probabilities, looks at how abnormal an event would be or how much explanation it would need. The mathematics of normic risk are somewhat different from those of probabilistic risk. When we divide up a possibility, the probabilistic risk gets spread out. But normic risk doesn't work like that. On the normic picture, risk is more like colour intensity. The brighter the possibility, the higher the risk. When you divide a bright possibility, the segments are still just as bright. There'd be nothing abnormal about you being infected if you walked into the quarantine facility, but there'd also be nothing abnormal about you being infected in the first second, or in the next second, and so on. In the normic sense, all of these possibilities are high risk. If the de minimis threshold were defined in normic terms, then none of these possibilities could be ignored. On the normic approach, adopting a de minimis threshold is more like turning up the background colour. Any risks that are sufficiently dim will just fade away, while the brighter risks remain. So maybe it is okay to ignore some risks when making decisions, like the risk of a car accident on a short drive to the shops. But what makes it okay to ignore these risks is not that they're highly improbable, it's that they're highly abnormal.